settle in, perhaps with a cup of tea, because the story we are about to unpack is one of the most astonishing and heartbreaking cautionary tales of the 20th century. It's a story that proves, beyond a shadow of a doubt, that even when you possess more money than Midas, a life can still be exquisitely, tragically empty. Our subject today is a woman whose name for a certain generation was synonymous with unimaginable wealth and equally unimaginable misfortune. A woman whom the press famously dubbed the poor little rich girl. Her life was a cascade of palaces, private jets, legendary jewels, and a parade of husbands, princes, counts, movie stars, and even a secret agent. She was, for a time, one of the richest women in the world, an heiress to a fortune so vast it was almost abstract. Her name was Barbara Hutton, the heiress to the Woolworth five-and-dime store empire. She was beautiful, intelligent, and, by all accounts, desperately longed for happiness. Yet, for all her billions, happiness remained the one commodity she could never acquire. Even Truman Capote, the great chronicler of society's glittering elite, a man who adored delving into the hidden lives of the rich and powerful, recognized a profound, almost biblical tragedy in her story. He famously said of Barbara Hutton that she had everything but happiness, and that was a script he didn't want to rewrite. A man who built his career on rewriting, exposing, and dissecting the lives of the wealthy chose not to touch hers, not because it wasn't dramatic enough, but perhaps because it was too tragic, too raw, too close to the bone. What kind of life could inspire such a chilling assessment from Capote? How could a woman born into such immense privilege live a life so utterly devoid of peace? We're going to journey from the Gilded Age mansions of New York, through the glittering decadence of 1930s Europe, to the stark realities of war and the lonely decline of a woman who tried over and over again to buy love, to buy security, and to buy a happiness that money simply couldn't provide. This is the story of Barbara Hutton, the princess without a kingdom, the richest woman who was also the unhappiest. A woman who lived a life that was, in every conceivable way, an emotional disaster. To understand the profound tragedy of Barbara Hutton, we must first go back to the source of her immense yet ultimately crushing fortune. She was born not into the ancient titled aristocracy of Europe, but into the raw, vibrant heart of American capitalism at its most dynamic and ruthless, the Gilded Age. This was an era of unprecedented wealth creation, a time when men with names like Carnegie, Rockefeller, and Morgan were forging industrial empires and accumulating fortunes that dwarfed those of the old European kings. And among these titans was Barbara's grandfather, Frank Winfield Woolworth. He was not a banker or an oil baron. His genius was in something far more humble yet utterly revolutionary: the five-and-dime store. Frank Woolworth was the perfect archetype of the American dream. He was born into poverty in rural upstate New York, a farm boy with little education but a restless ambition. He started his career as a stock boy in a dry goods store, a world of cluttered shelves and haggled prices. It was there, amidst the bolts of fabric and barrels of crackers, that he hit upon an idea so simple it was brilliant. What if a store sold a wide variety of goods, all neatly displayed, all at a fixed low price? No haggling, no confusion, just an irresistible array of merchandise, priced at either 5 or 10 cents. His first few attempts failed, but Frank was tenacious. In 1879, he opened his great 5-cent store in Lancaster, Pennsylvania. It was an instant runaway success. He had tapped into the desires of a new and growing consumer class. He understood that ordinary people, especially women, wanted the dignity of shopping in a clean, well-lit store, to be able to afford small luxuries without being intimidated or cheated. He expanded with ferocious speed. The F.W. Woolworth Company became a national sensation, a sprawling empire of red-fronted stores that brought affordable consumer goods to millions. He was a pioneer in retail, introducing concepts like mass purchasing, customer service, and strategic store placement that are still fundamental today. By the time of his death in 1919, he was one of the wealthiest men in America, having amassed a personal fortune estimated at $65 million, a truly astronomical sum for that era, equivalent to well over $1 billion in today's money. He crowned his success by building a monument to his empire, the iconic Woolworth Building in New York City. Completed in 1913, it was, for a time, the tallest building in the world, a soaring Gothic masterpiece dubbed the Cathedral of Commerce. It was a powerful statement, a new kind of royalty. The royalty of American industry had arrived. This was the golden river that Barbara Hutton was born into. She arrived on November 14, 1912, not in a log cabin, but in the opulent heart of New York's Fifth Avenue. Her parents were the socially ambitious Edna Woolworth, Frank's beloved daughter, and Franklin Laws Hutton, a handsome and charming investment banker from a prominent New York family. Franklin was a co-founder of the successful brokerage firm E.F. Hutton. On the surface, it was a marriage of immense wealth and impeccable social standing. Barbara was, in every material sense, born with a solid gold spoon in her mouth. Her nursery, no doubt, was filled with the finest imported toys, her clothing made by the best seamstresses, her every whim catered to by a retinue of nannies, maids, and footmen. She was a princess of this new American dynasty. But beneath this glittering, almost blinding surface, her early childhood was a landscape of profound emotional deprivation and creeping tragedy. Her father, Franklin Hutton, was a man who adored the trappings of wealth and society, but seemed to have little time for the quiet duties of fatherhood. He was emotionally distant, frequently absent, and notoriously unfaithful to his wife. He was a man more interested in his business dealings, his yacht, and the company of other women than in the emotional needs of his young daughter. His presence in Barbara's early life was fleeting, a handsome, charming, but ultimately cold and unreliable figure. Her mother, Edna, was equally ill-equipped to provide the warmth and security a child so desperately needs. Edna had inherited a third of her father's colossal fortune, but none of his business acumen or his grounded, resilient personality. She was a deeply insecure and socially anxious woman, constantly striving to maintain her position in the cutthroat world of New York society, a world that often looked down on new money like the Woolworths. She sought solace and escape in lavish spending, in social climbing, and, most tragically, in the bottom of a bottle. She was an alcoholic, and her bouts of drinking made her increasingly erratic, unpredictable, and emotionally unavailable to her daughter. The atmosphere in their vast, opulent mansion was not one of love and laughter, but of a deep, pervasive emotional chill. Barbara was surrounded by wealth, by servants, by everything money could buy, but she was starved of the one thing that truly mattered: genuine, consistent, and unconditional parental love. This profound emotional vacuum, this feeling of being an unseen and unloved accessory in her parents' glamorous lives, would become the defining feature of her entire existence. Then, when Barbara was just 4 years old, her fragile world shattered irrevocably. In May of 1917, her mother, Edna Hutton, just 33 years old, succumbed to the depths of her despair. She was found dead in her lavish suite at the Plaza Hotel in New York. The cause of death, according to some reports, was suicide by poison. It was a scandal of immense proportions. The Woolworth and Hutton families, terrified of the public shame, used their immense influence to control the narrative. The official cause of death was hastily attributed to mastoiditis, a severe ear infection that had led to suffocation. But the whispers in New York society and the truth in the hearts of the family were undeniable. Edna Woolworth Hutton had taken her own life. And according to some harrowing accounts, it was the 4-year-old Barbara herself who discovered her mother's body. Imagine for a moment the psychological impact of this event on a small child. The sudden, violent, and utterly incomprehensible disappearance of her mother. The hushed, panicked tones of the adults, the somber faces, the palpable grief and scandal that permeated the grand house. It is likely that Barbara was never truly told what had happened, shielded by the polite lies and evasions of an era that treated suicide as an unspeakable shame. But a child, even a very young one, senses the truth. She would have felt the sudden, terrifying void, the horror of abandonment, and the unspoken guilt that hangs in the air after such a tragedy. This early catastrophic trauma, this primal wound of losing her mother to suicide and feeling utterly abandoned by her father, would become the dark blueprint for all the emotional struggles that followed. It instilled in her a deep-seated, almost pathological fear of being left alone, a desperate, lifelong need for love and approval, and a profound insecurity that would haunt her to her final days. She was a child with everything the world could offer, but in that moment, she lost the most precious thing of all, her sense of safety, her sense of being loved, her mother. The poor little rich girl had been born. In the devastating aftermath of her mother's suicide, young Barbara's life became a strange, isolated odyssey through the gilded cages of her wealthy relatives. Her father, Franklin Hutton, proved to be as absent and emotionally unavailable as ever. Displaying a breathtaking lack of sensitivity, he married another woman less than a year after Edna's death. For Barbara, this was the ultimate confirmation of her abandonment. Her father had a new wife, a new life, and she was, it seemed, a leftover from a past he was eager to forget. She was largely shunted between various relatives, none of whom seemed truly equipped or willing to provide the genuine love and stable environment she so desperately needed. She was a child passed from one magnificent mansion to another, an inconvenient reminder of a family tragedy. While each of these environments offered immense material comfort, they offered little in the way of true emotional nourishment. The prevailing attitude in many wealthy families of that era was that children were to be seen and not heard, to be cared for by a rotating cast of governesses and tutors, and to be presented beautifully, but not necessarily to be emotionally engaged with. She spent considerable time in the care of her maternal grandmother, Jenny Woolworth, a matriarch hardened by her own difficult life and the struggle of helping her husband build his empire. While she may have provided a stable roof over Barbara's head, her temperament was not one of warmth or gentle affection. Jenny was a woman of stern Victorian principles, a believer in duty and propriety, and she was primarily concerned with maintaining appearances and upholding the family name. The grief over her own daughter Edna's suicide was immense, but it seems to have manifested in a rigid, almost unforgiving approach to raising Barbara rather than a comforting one. There was little space for a vulnerable child's grief in that imposing household. Barbara's childhood was, by all accounts, intensely, painfully lonely. She recalled long, silent hours spent by herself, wandering the vast museum-like rooms of her relatives' mansions, surrounded by priceless art and antique furniture, but utterly devoid of human companionship. She had no siblings, and her interactions with other children were often formal, supervised affairs. This isolation was compounded by the constant presence of servants who catered to her every material need but could not fill the void of a parent's love. She was never taught basic life skills, never allowed to experience the simple grounding activities that ordinary children take for granted, like making her own bed or learning to cook a simple meal. She grew up in a world of absolute dependency, a state that would leave her helpless and vulnerable throughout her adult life. This profound loneliness led her to seek solace in various forms, most notably in food. Even as a young child, she began to struggle with her weight, developing an unhealthy relationship with eating as a coping mechanism for her emotional pain and boredom. This was the beginning of a lifelong battle with eating disorders, a deeply personal struggle that began in this desolate childhood. Food became both her comfort and her tormentor, a symptom of her desperate need for control in a life where she felt she had none, and a reflection of an underlying self-loathing that was taking root. Her one constant companion, and perhaps the only person who offered her a semblance of genuine, uncomplicated affection, was her cousin, James P. Donahue Jr., known to the family as Jimmy. Jimmy was a few years older than Barbara, the son of one of her mother's sisters, and he understood her isolation in a way no adult seemed to. He was her confidant, her playmate, her partner in mischief, and the one person with whom she felt a true, unburdened connection. He was her first and perhaps only truly unconditional love. This bond would prove to be a bittersweet one, as Jimmy's own life would be marked by flamboyance, scandal, and a destructive lifestyle that mirrored aspects of Barbara's own tragic trajectory. But in those lonely childhood years, his presence was a vital lifeline. As she entered adolescence, the full weight of her inheritance, the golden albatross around her neck began to loom over her. She wasn't just a rich girl. She was destined to be one of the richest women in the world. The trust her grandfather had established was accumulating a staggering amount of wealth, and the press, with its insatiable appetite for stories of the rich and famous, began to take notice. She became a public figure before she was old enough to understand what that meant. Her coming out party, her formal debut into society, became a flashpoint that would define her public image for years to come. In 1930, at the age of 18, her family threw her a debutante ball at the Ritz-Carlton Hotel in New York. The timing could not have been worse. America was in the grip of the Great Depression. Millions were unemployed, standing in bread lines, their lives shattered by the stock market crash of the previous year. Against this backdrop of national suffering, Barbara Hutton's debutante ball was a spectacle of almost obscene extravagance. The family reportedly spent $60,000 on the event, the equivalent of over $1 million today. The ballroom was transformed into a silver and blue wonderland filled with thousands of birch trees. 4 orchestras provided the music. The guests, 1,000 of New York's high society elite, were served rivers of champagne and mountains of caviar. It was a party designed to announce in the most spectacular way possible the arrival of a great heiress. But the public reaction was not one of admiration. It was one of fury. Newspapers across the country decried the ball as a tasteless, heartless display of wealth in a time of national crisis. She was condemned in editorials and even in sermons. The girl who had grown up so lonely, so desperate for approval, was suddenly one of the most hated young women in America. This event cemented the poor little rich girl narrative in the public mind. It was the ultimate paradox, a moment designed to be a personal triumph that instead brought her public scorn and condemnation. The experience was deeply wounding for Barbara. It reinforced her sense of being an outsider, an object of envy and resentment. She fled the hostile glare of the American press and embarked on a tour of Europe, a journey that would become a permanent exile. She would never truly live in the United States again. Finally, the moment that had defined her entire life arrived. On her 21st birthday, in November 1933, Barbara Hutton came into her full inheritance. The exact amount was the subject of much speculation, but it was estimated to be around $50 million. In today's money, accounting for inflation and the relative power of wealth in that era, this fortune would be worth well over $1 billion. She became in an instant a global celebrity, a figure of mythic wealth. But this moment of financial emancipation was not a moment of joy. It was a moment of immense crushing pressure. She was now solely responsible for a fortune she had never been taught how to manage, and she was surrounded by a world of advisors, lawyers, and potential suitors, their motives all suspect. The money, instead of being a source of liberation, became her greatest burden, a golden cage from which she would never escape. She was about to embark on a life that would prove over and over again that money truly cannot buy happiness, and that the loneliest person in the world can be the one who has everything. Armed with an almost limitless fortune and crippled by a lifetime of emotional insecurity, Barbara Hutton was cast onto the world stage. She was a figure of global fascination, the ultimate prize in the international marriage market. But for Barbara, it wasn't about power or prestige. Her life became a relentless, almost frantic quest for the one thing her money had never been able to provide: love. And in this quest, she would embark on a dramatic, often scandalous parade of 7 marriages, each one a hopeful new beginning, and each one ultimately a heartbreaking and expensive failure. Her first marriage in 1933 was perhaps the most spectacular, and in hindsight, the most predictably ill-fated. She married Alexis Midivani, a man who claimed to be a Georgian prince. The marrying Midivanis, as they were cynically known, were a notorious trio of handsome, impossibly charming, but utterly penniless Georgian émigrés who had fled their homeland after the Russian Revolution. They had carved out a unique and very profitable niche for themselves in high society. They specialized in marrying rich American heiresses. Alexis was perfectly cast for the role. He was dashing, exotic, and possessed a talent for flattery and romantic gestures that was like a drug to the insecure and love-starved Barbara. He made her feel seen, adored, and cherished in a way no one ever had before. She fell head over heels in love, convinced she had found her prince charming. The wedding held in Paris was the social event of the year, a spectacle of unimaginable extravagance that was chronicled in breathless detail by newspapers around the world. Barbara, in a gesture of both love and financial power, reportedly spent $1 million on the wedding and on a trousseau that included priceless jewels from Cartier. They embarked on a lavish, globe-trotting lifestyle, traveling on private yachts, staying in royal suites, and accumulating magnificent homes, including a palace in Venice. But the fairy tale quickly and brutally unraveled. It became painfully clear that Alexis was far more interested in Barbara's bank account than in her heart. He was a notorious gambler and a shameless philanderer. He spent her millions with a casual, almost contemptuous abandon on cars, on polo ponies, on other women, and on his staggering gambling debts. Barbara, desperate to hold on to his affection, tried to buy his love. She showered him with more gifts, more jewels, more extravagant trips. But it was a futile and humiliating exercise. The marriage lasted only 2 years, ending in a bitter divorce in 1935. The settlement cost Barbara a fortune. It was a devastating blow, a public confirmation of her deepest, most painful fear, that she was only loved for her money. Barely a year later, in 1936, still reeling from the Mindavani debacle, Barbara tried again, determined to find a different kind of man. Her second husband was Count Kurt Hogwitz Reventlow, a Danish aristocrat with German roots. Reventlow was the stark opposite of the charming, frivolous Mindavani. He was older, stern, intensely serious, and deeply controlling. He saw Barbara's immense wealth not as a plaything, but as a serious business to be managed, and he saw Barbara herself as a project to be reformed. He immediately took control of her finances and her life. He forced her onto a strict diet and exercise regimen, encouraging her to take up tennis. He also, according to many reports, pressured her into a decision that would have lasting and painful consequences, giving up her American citizenship to become a Danish citizen, ostensibly to avoid the heavy U.S. taxes on her fortune. This act, which she would later deeply regret, made her feel like an exile, severing her last formal tie to her homeland. With Reventlow, Barbara had her only child, a son named Lance, born in London in 1936. For a brief, hopeful period, it seemed that motherhood might offer her the stability and unconditional love she had always craved. Lance was a beautiful, adored child, and by all accounts, Barbara doted on him. But the marriage itself was a nightmare. Reventlow was not just controlling, he was emotionally, and according to some reports, physically abusive. He knew her deepest insecurities and used them against her, constantly criticizing her appearance and her intelligence. He reportedly told her she was fat and ugly, even as her eating disorders caused her to waste away. This constant verbal abuse, combined with his authoritarian control, pushed Barbara deeper into her personal hell. Her anorexia and bulimia worsened, and her reliance on prescription drugs to cope with the anxiety and depression began to spiral into a serious addiction. Her desperate need for his approval only made her more vulnerable to his cruelty. The marriage finally collapsed in 1938 in another acrimonious and very public divorce, which was followed by a bitter and protracted custody battle for their son Lance. From this wreckage, Barbara gained custody of the one precious thing in her life, her beloved son. But she emerged from the marriage more damaged, more fragile, and more convinced of her own unworthiness than ever before. The trauma of these two early marriages, one with a predatory charmer, the other with a sadistic controller, cemented Barbara's profound distrust of men and her own self-worth. The public, observing this rapid succession of failed marriages, continued to pity and criticize her, reinforcing the poor little rich girl narrative. She was seen as flighty, foolish, and unable to find happiness despite having every advantage. But then, a glimmer of true Hollywood glamour entered her life. A man who seemed to be the perfect antidote to her past. In 1942, in the midst of the Second World War, Barbara married perhaps her most famous husband, the one and only Cary Grant. Grant was the epitome of suave sophistication, one of Hollywood's biggest and most beloved stars. He was also, unlike her previous husbands, genuinely wealthy in his own right, having earned his fortune through his brilliant film career and shrewd investments. He famously and firmly refused to take a single penny of Barbara's money, a gesture that, for a time, deeply touched her and allowed her to lower her guard. He seemed to want her for herself. He was kind, witty, and tried to be a loving and supportive husband. He encouraged her to simplify her life, to focus on herself and her son, whom he adored. He lovingly called her Wooly, a playful, affectionate nickname that tried to diminish the heavy burden of her family fortune. For a brief, hopeful period, it seemed that Barbara had finally, miraculously, found happiness. The press dubbed them Cash and Cary. They were one of a kind, but Barbara's deep-seated insecurities and her lifetime of psychological damage proved to be too formidable an opponent, even for Cary Grant. She craved his attention and affection, but her own self-loathing made it difficult for her to accept it. She would push him away, create drama, and retreat into her world of illness and pills. Her ongoing struggles with anorexia, exacerbated by her drug use, put an immense strain on the marriage. Grant tried, but he was ultimately ill-equipped to be a therapist for a woman so profoundly wounded. The marriage, a seemingly perfect union of Hollywood glamour and old-world wealth, lasted only 3 years, ending in an amicable divorce in 1945. It was a separation that both parties genuinely seemed to regret. Grant remained a lifelong friend and protector to both Barbara and her son Lance. He later said that Barbara was a lonely, complicated woman and sadly admitted, "I couldn't save her." For many, this was the definitive confirmation. If even the great Cary Grant couldn't make Barbara Hutton happy, then no one could. The search, it seemed, was hopeless. As Barbara Hutton's string of failed marriages continued into the post-war era, her personal life began to slide deeper into a relentless cycle of extravagance, isolation, and addiction. Her immense wealth, once a symbol of her potential, became the primary tool for a life of frantic and ultimately hollow distraction. She spent her fortune with a desperate, almost vengeful abandon, as if trying to buy fleeting moments of happiness, or perhaps simply to feel something, anything, other than the gnawing emptiness within. Her jewelry collection became the stuff of legend, an almost mythical hoard of historical and unique gems that rivaled those of any royal house. These weren't just adornments, they were a form of armor, a glittering statement of her identity, and perhaps a desperate attempt to fill the emotional void. The bigger and more famous the jewel, the more it seemed to validate her existence. She owned some of the most famous jewels in the world. There was the 40-carat Pasha diamond, a magnificent octagonal-cut blue-white gem that had once belonged to an Egyptian sultan. She acquired a pair of flawless natural black pearls that were said to have belonged to Catherine the Great of Russia, and another pair of magnificent white pearls that were part of the crown jewels of France, having once been worn by Queen Marie Antoinette. She commissioned a stunning diamond tiara from Van Cleef and Arpels, and a spectacular Cartier necklace made of enormous rubies that had belonged to a Romanov Grand Duchess. Her most daring acquisition was an emerald necklace, also from Cartier, featuring stones that had once been the prized possession of a Mughal emperor. She would wear these priceless historic pieces with a casual disregard that shocked even the most jaded society observers. She would sometimes pair a $1 million diamond necklace with a simple cashmere sweater, or wear Marie Antoinette's pearls to a casual lunch. It was a way of saying, "This is just me. This is my life. I can afford it, and I don't care what you think." The jewels were her companions, silent, glittering witnesses to her lonely life. Her homes were equally magnificent, each one a fantasy palace designed for a queen who ruled over a kingdom of one. She owned grand estates in London, Paris, and Palm Beach. In Cuernavaca, Mexico, she built a sprawling, exquisite Japanese-style palace, complete with authentic temples and gardens, a surreal escape from the Western world. But her most famous and perhaps most revealing home was the Villa Mabrouka in Tangier, Morocco. Footage of Villa Mabrouka emphasizing its grandeur and isolation. This was her primary refuge, a breathtaking Moorish palace she purchased from the reigning sultan and completely renovated. It was perched high on a cliff overlooking the Strait of Gibraltar, a fortress of solitude. It was decorated with impeccable, if theatrical, taste, filled with priceless art and antiques, and maintained by a massive staff of over 40 servants. It was here, in this exotic, isolated kingdom, that she would throw her most legendary parties. Tangier in the mid-20th century was an international zone, a unique, lawless city that was a magnet for spies, artists, writers, and wealthy eccentrics. Barbara's parties were spectacles of luxury, often lasting for days on end, fueled by rivers of champagne, mountains of caviar, and a sense of hedonistic escape. She would fly in famous bands from London and Paris. Her guest lists were a mix of deposed royalty, Hollywood film stars, and the bohemian writers of the Beat generation. But even in these magnificent settings, surrounded by her glittering guests, Barbara remained profoundly, achingly lonely. Eyewitness accounts from these parties often painted a picture of a woman who was present but distant, a hostess who was immaculately dressed and bejeweled, but whose eyes betrayed a deep, ineffable sadness. She would often retreat to her private rooms for hours, leaving her guests to their own devices, or she would engage in a kind of detached, almost performative conviviality. She was searching for connection, but her fame and her fortune created an insurmountable barrier. People were there for the spectacle, for the free champagne, for the chance to rub shoulders with a living legend. Very few were there for Barbara herself. Her personal struggles deepened into a terrifying abyss. Her battle with eating disorders, anorexia and bulimia, became more pronounced. She would fluctuate wildly in weight, at times becoming alarmingly skeletally thin, at other times bloated from comfort, eating followed by periods of purging. These were not just physical ailments, they were deeply rooted psychological battles, symptoms of her lifelong self-loathing and her desperate need for control in a life that felt utterly out of her grasp. And her reliance on drugs became a crippling addiction. She became dependent on a dangerous cocktail of amphetamines to give her energy and fight her appetite, powerful sleeping pills to find rest, and various other substances to dull the constant gnawing emotional pain. This drug use, combined with her fragile physical health, made her increasingly volatile, paranoid, and unpredictable. She would suffer from periods of profound depression, followed by bursts of manic energy and spending, all played out against the backdrop of unimaginable wealth. Her fourth marriage, after the departure of Cary Grant, was a brief but telling episode. In 1947, she married Prince Igor Trubetskoy, a Russian prince in exile who had become a famous international sportsman, excelling at everything from bobsledding to auto racing. He was dashing and athletic, but notoriously moody and uncommunicative. This marriage, too, followed the familiar, tragic pattern. Initial hope, followed by disillusionment and misery. Trubetskoy was a distant figure, more interested in his sports and his own pursuits than in nurturing the fragile Barbara. Their life together, often spent in Morocco, was glamorous, but emotionally sterile. This marriage ended in 1951, after just 4 years, further cementing Barbara's reputation for romantic failure. But it was her fifth marriage that was perhaps the most notorious and self-destructive of them all. In 1953, she married Porfirio Rubirosa, a diplomat from the Dominican Republic who was, without question, the most famous and accomplished playboy of the 20th century. Ruby, as he was known, was devastatingly handsome, impossibly charming, and a ruthless womanizer. He was a master of the game, a man who lived purely for pleasure and conquest. He had already been married to two of the richest women in the world, including the actress Zsa Gabor. For Barbara, He represented everything she craved at that moment: raw masculine allure, excitement, and a sense of being desired by a man who was desired by every other woman in the world. The marriage was a brief, explosive, and humiliating disaster. It was a whirlwind of lavish parties, fast cars, and public drama. Barbara bought Rubirosa a fleet of luxury cars, including a custom-built Ferrari, and even a decommissioned B-25 bomber from the war surplus, which he intended to convert into a private plane. But Rubirosa was utterly and shamelessly unfaithful, continuing his affairs openly. Barbara once again tried to buy his affection and fidelity, showering him with gifts and cash. But it was useless. The marriage lasted a mere 53 days, ending in one of the quickest and most notorious divorces in history. It was a humiliating public spectacle, a fresh, deep wound for a woman already covered in scars. The pattern of seeking love in all the wrong places and failing to find it was now firmly, tragically established. Each broken marriage chipped away at her already fragile self-esteem. The world gossiped, but few truly understood the depths of her suffering. She was a woman who was perpetually searching for love and acceptance, but her own demons and the constant, corrupting presence of her colossal fortune always got in the way. She was accumulating palaces, jewels, and husbands, but losing herself bit by bit with each passing year. The abyss was deepening, and the final, most terrible tragedy of her life was still to come. As Barbara Hutton entered the 1960s and 70s, the dazzling, frantic light of her youth and her extravagant prime began to fade, giving way to a profound, almost unbearable sadness. The woman who had been the world's poor little rich girl was now simply a poor, lonely, and increasingly frail woman, despite the lingering vestiges of her once colossal fortune. The endless parade of marriages, the relentless, almost pathological spending, and her lifelong battles with addiction had taken an immense and irreversible toll, both physically and financially. Her sixth husband, whom she married in 1955, was an old friend, the German tennis star Baron Gottfried von Cramm. Von Cramm was a gentle, kind, and genuinely decent man, a stark contrast to the predators and playboys of her past. He had his own tragic history, having been imprisoned by the Nazis for his homosexuality. He was genuinely fond of Barbara and tried to offer her companionship and a stable, caring presence. But by this point, Barbara was too deeply entrenched in her habits and her emotional patterns. Her drug use was severe, her insecurities profound, and her ability to accept genuine, quiet love had been utterly eroded. The marriage lasted 4 years, ending in 1959. Von Cramm, a man of quiet dignity, simply couldn't reach her in her self-imposed prison of sadness. Her final 2 marriages were brief, desperate, and almost farcical attempts to find solace in an increasingly isolated world. In 1964, she made her 7th and final attempt at marriage, wedding Prince Pierre Raymondon, a man who claimed to be a prince from an old Vietnamese royal line. By this point, the marriages were less about a search for love and more about a desperate attempt to have someone by her side. This union, too, proved brief and humiliating, ending after just 2 years in 1966. By this point, the marriages were less about a search for love and more about a desperate attempt to have someone, anyone by her side, in the vast, empty palaces. Her health was now in a state of catastrophic decline. Her eating disorders had ravaged her body, leaving her perpetually frail and prone to illness. Her dependence on a cocktail of various medications had eroded her mental clarity and her physical well-being. She suffered from a range of ailments, from chronic pain to deep, debilitating depression, which often left her bedridden for weeks or even months at a time. And her legendary fortune, The one thing that had always seemed inexhaustible was now rapidly diminishing. She'd inherited $50 million in 1933, a sum that, properly managed, should have grown exponentially, but she had spent it with a complete and utter disregard for financial prudence. Her 7 divorces, each costing millions in settlements and legal fees, had been a huge drain. Her lavish lifestyle, the palaces, the yachts, the private jets, the armies of staff, the priceless jewels, and the endless, desperate gifts to her husbands and hangers-on, was unsustainable, even for a Woolworth heiress. She was notoriously and often foolishly generous, but she was also prone to being swindled by a succession of unscrupulous financial advisors and opportunistic lovers. By the early 1970s, the richest woman in the world was astonishingly facing serious financial difficulties. She was forced to begin the painful process of liquidating her assets. She sold off many of her beloved homes and then, most painfully piece by piece, her legendary jewelry collection. The very symbols of her wealth and her identity were put up for auction, each sale a quiet public admission of her decline. These sales were not just financial transactions, they were deeply emotional acts, each jewel representing a dream, a hope, a memory of a time when she believed money could buy happiness. The physical shedding of her gems was a metaphor for the emotional stripping away of her illusions. But the final, most devastating blow was yet to come. Her relationship with her only son, Lance Raventlow, had always been a source of both immense love and profound pain. Lance, who had been doted upon by Barbara as a child, grew up to be a handsome, charming, but ultimately troubled young man. He was a professional race car driver of some talent, a notorious playboy, and a man who struggled his entire life to find his own identity in the suffocating shadow of his mother's fame and fortune. Like Barbara, he was drawn to reckless behavior and reportedly struggled with addiction. He was, in many ways, a mirror of her own struggles, a tragic legacy of her unstable upbringing and his own poor little rich boy status. In 1972, the ultimate tragedy struck. Lance Raventlow was killed when the small plane he was a passenger in crashed in the Rocky Mountains of Colorado. He was only 36 years old. For Barbara, this was the final unendurable blow. Losing her only child, her only true lifelong connection to unconditional love, was an unbearable loss. It plunged her into an even deeper, blacker depression, a well of grief from which she would never truly recover. The woman who had been abandoned as a child by her mother now had to endure the ultimate, unnatural abandonment, the death of her own child. It was the cruelest possible twist of fate, the final horrifying echo of her childhood trauma ringing through her adult life. In her final years, Barbara Hutton became a virtual recluse, living in the imperial suite of the luxurious Beverly Wilshire Hotel in Los Angeles. She was skeletal, often confused, and surrounded by a dwindling circle of paid companions and nurses. The vibrant, glamorous heiress was now a shadow of her former self, a living testament to the destructive power of too much money and too little love. She died on May 11, 1979, at the age of 66. The official cause of death was a heart attack, but the underlying causes were a lifetime of physical and emotional self-abuse, profound neglect, and a loneliness so complete it was like a disease. By the time of her death, her once colossal fortune had dwindled to a mere $3,500 in her checking account. The richest woman in the world died, effectively penniless, the final bitter irony of a life defined by wealth. She was buried in the Woolworth family mausoleum in the Bronx, a quiet end to a life lived at full volume. Her passing was noted in newspapers around the world, but by then, the poor little rich girl was largely a forgotten figure, a ghost from a bygone era of extravagant wealth and celebrity. The world had moved on. The Woolworth five and dime stores, the very source of her fortune, were themselves in decline, eventually closing their doors across America in the 1990s. The grand institutions that had defined her life, the great department stores, the old aristocratic titles, the unquestioned power of inherited wealth, were all fading into history. So, what is the lasting significance of Barbara Hutton's story? What can we learn from this extraordinary yet heartbreaking life? Her life is a potent, almost biblical cautionary tale about the illusion of material wealth. It is a stark reminder that money, when unmoored from a strong sense of self, purpose, or genuine human connection, can become a uniquely destructive force. It can attract predators and sycophants, amplify insecurities, and ultimately isolate a person in a gilded cage of their own making. Barbara Hutton had everything the world could offer in terms of luxury and privilege, but she lacked the fundamental emotional tools to navigate her own life. Her story also highlights the profound and lasting impact of childhood trauma. The abandonment and loss she experienced as a young child created a wound that never healed, driving her desperate, lifelong quest for love and acceptance. This quest, fueled by an almost limitless fortune, became a self-fulfilling prophecy of failure as her insecurities and her inability to trust pushed away the very love she so desperately craved. In a broader sense, Barbara Hutton's life serves as a fascinating historical document of an era. She was a living embodiment of the Jazz Age extravagance, the shifting social landscape of the 20th century, and the persistent, often tragic allure of the celebrity heiress. She lived a life that was both ridiculously opulent and profoundly miserable, a paradox that continues to captivate and haunt us. Perhaps the most poignant reflection comes back to Truman Capote, the great observer of her world. He understood that some stories, even the most dramatic and glittering ones, are too heartbreaking to revisit, too complete in their tragedy to be rewritten. Barbara Hutton's life was a script of relentless sorrow, a testament to the fact that even with all the money in the world, the greatest riches are the ones that lie within: love, peace, and a quiet sense of self-worth. These are the treasures that money simply cannot buy, and their absence left the poor little rich girl utterly impoverished, in the deepest and most human sense of the word. Her life remains a powerful melancholic echo, a reminder that the human heart, no matter how much gold surrounds it, still yearns for something far more precious.